to the 68th episode of the Atlas Society Asks. My name is Jennifer Anju Grossman. My friends know me as Jag. Today, I'm very proud to be joined by Robert Tracinski. Before I even begin to introduce Robert, I wanted to remind all of you who are watching us on Zoom, on Facebook, on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube. You can use the comment section to type in your questions. Go ahead and get started. We'll get to as many of them as we can, though I have to warn you, I have quite a few questions for Robert myself. Robert Tracinski is, of course, the author of the Tracinski Letter, a newsletter that covers culture and politics from an individualist perspective, and the author of So, Who is John Galt Anyway, a reader's guide to Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. He has been a writer, lecturer, commentator for over 25 years by now. He's edited and published The Intellectual Activist, an Objectivist Review, served as editor for Real Clear Politics, writing for The Federalist, and hosting a podcast and an editor at Symposium. So, Robert, welcome again. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. Pleasure to be here.
So, I'd like to first cover a bit on current events because you have written so much about, what went wrong in Afghanistan. You have discussed the role of our Afghan allies, and there's a lot of, current explanations and excuses. What are those getting wrong about what's happened in Afghanistan from your perspective?
Right. So, how long do you have? As to what went wrong in Afghanistan, there's going to be a lot of discussion, a lot of different things we can talk about. We could talk about the training of the Afghan army, where we trained them to fight with U.S. support. And the minute U.S. support disappeared, they were basically unable to continue. There's all sorts of things we've done wrong, but I think the fundamental thing we did wrong was a cognitive failure. It was a failure to think long-term, a failure to find a strategy and stick to it over a very long term and find one that's sustainable over a very long term. What you had really was, this had a big impact on my career because I was just sort of starting to get an audience and purchase as a writer when September 11th happened. And so discussing what to do about the war on terror, what to do in Afghanistan, loomed very large for me. But I found that the American public paid attention for about 4 years, and then they tuned out and they didn't want to hear any more about it. They didn't want to think any more about it. And so when I hear people talk about the burden of the war in Afghanistan, well, the burden wasn't high for the average person. It wasn't noticeable. The only burden was a cognitive one, that you had to continue paying attention. And there's a sort of an Afghan saying, it's attributed to various Taliban leaders, that you have the watches, but we have the time. And this is the idea that, America has all this high technology, we have this material superiority, but what we don't have is we don't have the patience to see something like this through. And they figured if they just wait us out, eventually we would get bored and would go away. And that's kind of what happened, is that we have, I think the last real attempt to focus on Afghanistan was a half-hearted one by President Obama about 10 years ago. He did the politicians thing. He couldn't commit to doing a surge. He couldn't commit to doing withdrawal. He sort of did something in between. And since then, there has not been that sort of focus of, let's review what our strategy is. How is it working? How do we achieve a successful result? It was just sort of temporizing in half measures, and it was always on the back burner. And eventually the result was, well, since we haven't gotten anywhere, we're tired, let's just get out. And what you see is, getting out is what the last couple of weeks have looked like. And I don't think it's going to be a very good ending. I don't think it's going to actually end our involvement, because what you have now is you have the Taliban going around saying, look, we're invincible, we're invulnerable. We struck, the United States came at us with all the power of a superpower, and then we won. So they're just going to be emboldened. And I think, they're not going, this idea, there's a fantasy going around right now that we're going to have them as a partner to help us suppress Al-Qaeda because it's in their interest. In what way would it be in their interest? They just fund against us.
Mhm. Well, after 9/11, you anticipated a war that would be won on the battlefield and lost in Washington, D.C. It seems like from what you've just been describing, that's kind of what happened. You also said in war, as in everything else, one cannot choose outcomes, only actions. And on that note, in retrospect, you said the man you missed the most was George W. Bush. Why is that?
I might be alone in that sentiment, but
Well, that's why I wanted to hear it, because you've got a lot of unusual, unorthodox, unconventional sentiments. We're going to get to some of them, but I couldn't resist that one.
Well, so the reason I miss Bush is that he made a lot of mistakes, but he was actually really trying. There was a sense with him that, he was there at ground zero at 9/11, and he talked about the impact that had on him, and the sense that he regarded the war on terror and the threat of terrorism as a real thing, right? And not the way the politicians think about an issue. Politicians think about an issue. They think of it as, well, there's a pressure group, and what is the media going to say? And I'm going to get criticized by this person, and somebody will do something on Twitter. And they think about the pressures and the sort of second-handed, I can use that term for objectivists, the second-handed influences on them to conform to one pressure group or another. That's how a politician thinks about it. And George W. Bush, he had that aspect to him. He was a politician, but when it came to the war on terror, he thought about things in a more of it as a real thing that he really had to get right. And the one thing I give him lots of credit for was what happened in Iraq, because in Iraq things were going downhill. And in 2006, he sat down and said, let's rethink the entire strategy. You switched to a proper counterinsurgency strategy, found David Petraeus to implement it, and really actually had an impact of a unusually successful impact of turning things around in Iraq for about a year into his last year in office. So there's that sense that he was actually engaged in this and thought it was important. And what I've missed about the war on terrorism after that is there hasn't been a president since then who has been engaged and actually thought it was important. They've all thought it was a distraction to the other things that they wanted to do. And like I said, Obama was the politician who wouldn't withdraw us from the war on terrorism, but he wouldn't really commit to it either. He just sort of stayed in between of which path would get him the least criticism. And I think that's what I miss about it, is the idea that, America is so powerful that if we want to do something, we actually have the capability to do it. But what happens is that, especially in foreign policy, because somebody said on Twitter the other day, something I liked, which is America's a country so big, you could spend your whole life taking vacations inside of it and never get bored, right? So it's very easy for us to say, let's just stay here in this big country of ours and ignore the rest of the world. So in foreign policy, we have a hard time maintaining any idea, beyond the moment of a crisis. There's a great story I like to tell. It's from Dashiell Hammett, the sort of hard-boiled detective fiction writer. In one of his Sam Spade stories, Sam Spade talks about how he was hired once by a woman to find her husband had disappeared, and he was hired to find out what happened to the guy. And he finds out that the guy was walking down the street one day, and a beam from a construction site falls down and lands inches away from him. He has this near-death experience, and he changes his entire life. He goes on this series of adventures. But by the time Sam Spade catches up with him, he's in a new town with exactly the same kind of job he had before, a new family of exactly the same kind, exactly the same kind of wife he had before. And he's gone back exactly to his old life because the construction material stopped falling from the sky. He stopped having the near-death experience. So he goes back into his comfortable rut. And I think that's sort of what we did as a nation, in the years after 9/11. Skyscrapers stopped blowing up. So we decided, let's move on. We're not going to pay attention to this anymore. And I'm concerned that, we've stopped paying attention to them, but they haven't stopped paying attention to us.
Speaking of other politicians, including the current occupant of the White House, you had said that, quote, zero responsibility should be emblazoned on Biden's tombstone as the way that we remember his legacy. Can you elaborate?
Well, zero responsibility is something he said in response to a question last year about, do you feel you'd have any responsibility for the results of a withdrawal from Afghanistan? And he literally said zero responsibility. And I think we're sort of seeing in the last couple of weeks what zero responsibility looks like in practice, that he has seemed kind of aloof and distant, and like he's not really engaged. Like this is an annoyance that he wants to be over with and out of the way. And I think he's hoping that, a week from now, when nothing is actively happening on our TV screens, we'll all forget about it. So I think that, Joe Biden is, I think, he is somebody who could only have become a sane or accept a minimally acceptable alternative for president in the eyes of most people, only in the sort of debased context of our current politics, where his opponents were, Bernie Sanders in the primaries and Donald Trump in the general election. I almost feel like he's like this, he was going to sleepwalk his way into the presidency because everybody else did such a terrible job that he was left as the only person that the last man who was the least offensive person. But he is the article of Ayn Rand's that I want to revisit sometime soon is The Age of Mediocrity, because there she was complaining about Jimmy Carter, and I think she was complaining about Reagan. I think she was unfair on Reagan, but this idea of how is it that in this great nation of 300 million people with this storied history, that these are the people who are rising to the top as our choices for the presidency, and how is it we don't have something more people who are more serious and more engaged and more competent.
Well, I had a couple of other questions on Afghanistan, and also you've written one of your recent letters on China, which I'll recommend that our viewers go and check out. Perhaps we can put a link to it in our various threads on our platforms. But having just finished your book, So Who is John Galt Anyway? I want to spend a little bit of time on that. You were mentioning to me the origin story for this book.
Yes.
Perhaps you'll share it with our viewers.
Right. So Who is John Galt Anyway is a series of essays I wrote over a period of about 5 years or so for my newsletter, for the Tracinski letter. Originally for my subscribers, I actually kind of crowdfunded this effort from my subscribers. But the way it started out is I started another series called An Atheist Reads the Bible. And that's just me going through the Bible, book by book, chapter by chapter, coming up with some interesting things. It came from the fact that I had a fairly secular upbringing and I never really read the Bible. So at one point I sat down and said, I got to find out what's really in this. And it turns out there's some very interesting aspects to it, some things you might not expect, good and bad. But I started going through writing this series of books of articles in the Bible, and then I thought, well, wait a minute, I've got all these subscribers who are objectivists. They didn't necessarily sign up, to get churched up here to read about the Bible. I better, as compensation, throw them a few articles about Atlas Shrugged. And then as I got into it, I started coming up with more and more ideas of, I should write about this aspect, I should write about that aspect, and I ended up with 20 chapters. So it turned it into a bigger project that has made much and went a lot faster than the Bible. With the Bible, I'm only in. I just finished the book of Joshua, writing about that. So I'm still well into the beginning of the Old Testament. So this went a lot faster, but it was my attempt to sort of cover a whole range of issues of the literary aspects of Atlas Shrugged, the historical context of it, the philosophical themes in it. One of my favorite things was writing about Ayn Rand as a philosopher of the Enlightenment, because there's been a certain rebirth of interest in the Enlightenment in the last couple of years. You had Steven Pinker and Jonah Goldberg, some prominent people writing about the Enlightenment and looking at Ayn Rand as a philosopher of the Enlightenment, how she fits in with that tradition. And going through over all these different aspects, sort of things that I've learned from 25 years or actually more than 25 years now of reading Ayn Rand's novel, and thinking about it and about how it connects to the events of the world that I'm covering in the rest of my work as a commentator on politics.
Well, let's step back then and share with us. We talked about the origin story of your book, but how about the origin story with Ayn Rand? How did you originally get introduced to her ideas?
Yeah, so I was dragged into objectivism kicking and screaming. I initially started out, so I had a old friend named Robert Garmong. He's still around as an objectivist. But he and I were friends in high school, and he encountered the Fountainhead and started reading Ayn Rand and started bringing up all these arguments to me, and I started arguing against them. Right, so I was trying to refute Ayn Rand, but I sort of realized that, well, there's something there. So I said, okay, I have to read this and find out what it's about so I can refute it. Right, and you can see how well that worked out. But the interesting thing is, and this ties into a little bit to what I'm doing in the book, is that when I picked up Atlas Shrugged and I started reading that, I got about 200 pages in, and I put it down and I said, it's very compelling writing, but I don't think it's realistic. I don't think life is like this. And then there was this period of a couple of months where I'd be reading the newspaper or watching the TV and think, hey, that's just like something from Atlas Shrugged, right? And it just kept happening over and over again. It's this experience I think all fans of the novel have had at some point, of seeing something in the news, something happening in real life, and thinking, seeing the parallels to the novel. And that made me think, well, maybe life is like this. Maybe there is, maybe it's more realistic than I thought. So I read through all of that. I still wasn't satisfied, because before I encountered Ayn Rand, I was already interested in, my career goal was to be a philosopher. And so I was already very interested in philosophy. So I said, I have to go down to the deepest things. So I'm perhaps unusual in that the second book of Ayn Rand's that I read was The Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. And I have this very vivid memory of getting to the chapter on axiomatic concepts, where she explains, the basis and validity of the axioms at the basis of her whole metaphysics. And it kind of clicked for me there. And, the rest, as they say, is history. That once that clicked into place, it was just absorbing everything else. So I sort of set out to refute objectivism and set out to refute Ayn Rand's philosophy, and then ended up getting dragged into it, despite that effort.
Well, we're glad that you did.
But it connects to what I'm doing with the book, is that I got dragged into it because I saw all the connections to the outside world, and that was really what sort of pulled me in. And that's one of the things I really wanted to get across and convey in the book that in some of the chapters of this book.
So I touched on earlier how you are often an originator of some counterintuitive or unconventional takes on things, and one of those was in one of the more provocative arguments in the book, which was, all an Ayn Rand hero really wants is love, which certainly stands in stark contrast with some of the caricatures, some of which you mentioned in the book, including one by a conservative who said that Rand believed, quote, the parasitic weak deserve to be trod upon by the capitalistic powerful. So what did you mean by that? All an Ayn Rand hero really wants is love.
So one of the sort of side purposes of the book is to refute a lot of the, or answer a lot of the misconceptions. And the reason there are so many misconceptions is people come to Ayn Rand and to her books with certain categories, pre-constructed in their mind of, you're either this or you're that, you're either left or you're right, you're either in favor of the rich or in favor of the poor. And so therefore, if you have a bunch of heroes who are rich businessmen, then therefore you must hate the poor, right? That sort of, or you're the materialist or a spiritualist, and therefore if you celebrate material accomplishments and achievement, therefore you're a total materialist in the sense of not believing in anything, the spiritual value of anything. So a lot of this is basically saying Ayn Rand does not accept your categories, that the categories you go in with as your alternatives are not necessarily valid, and challenging them is a major part of the point of her philosophy and her novels. So all an Ayn Rand hero really wants is love, is what I came up with in answer, starting out with the idea that one of the caricatures is that the Ayn Rand loves the rich people, and being rich is the most important thing in Ayn Rand's philosophy. Now, if for those who started with the Fountainhead, you already know something that's wrong with this, because the Fountainhead is basically about a bunch of starving artists, right? And people who are going broke at several points in the novel to pursue their artistic vision. But the thing about Atlas Shrugged that I find interesting is that a lot of the main heroes in Atlas Shrugged are downwardly mobile. They give up massive fortunes, whereas a lot of the villains, I mean, at the end of the novel, Jim Taggart, the main villain, is probably the wealthiest man in the world, or one of the wealthiest men in the world. So a lot of the villains are themselves corrupt. You know, they're corrupt, what we call crony capitalists in the inexact language of today. But they're politically connected businessmen who are very wealthy, or they're politicians and political figures and bureaucrats who are not necessarily wealthy in and of themselves, but like the apparatchiks in the Soviet Union, they still manage to live very well. Whereas a lot of the heroes are people who give up their fortune. And, you know, Ellis Wyatt's the oil baron, and we next see him swinging a lunch pail on his way to work on this little small rig that he has in Gulch Gulch. So I was pointing out that process. But in addition to that, the thing I noticed is that making money is actually not the main focus of the lives of the main characters, because they take that for granted. They know how to make money, right? Being able to make money, being able to produce, being able to create a successful enterprise is not what's at stake for them in the novel. What's at stake for them is primarily a set of relationships of love, you know, relationships of love for their work, and also of love for each other. So, for example, the whole first part of Atlas Shrugged, the first main section of Atlas Shrugged, is really about, I think of it as being about the loneliness of the producers. And you have Hank Rearden and Dagny Taggart, you know, working hard to keep the economy afloat and keep the world moving, and facing hostility or indifference from everybody around them, including from their own family members, and having this tremendous sense that there's a scene early on. It's a scene where Dagny is seeing the newspaper reports of Francisco d'Anconia, which hits her pretty hard, you know, because of their history. And she sort of the music of Halley's Fourth Concerto, which is about this, you know, struggle against pain and despair, is playing, and it's her song and her cry. And so there's a tremendous sense of her being lonely, and of having a sense of being unrewarded and unrecognized in this work that she's doing. And then, of course, you can see how that drives the whole plot of the first part, because you have, you know, these two lonely producers who basically find each other in their relationship between Dagny and Hank Rearden. And so you can see that, especially, I think, in the scene at the end of the first run of the Jean Galt line, where all the Colorado producers are there, and they're all greeting each other. And it's almost like she's found this family that she never knew that she had. So there's this sense that, you know, what an Ayn Rand hero really wants is the spiritual value that's behind the material values that he produces. And that includes, you know, his love of his work, and also the love of the other people who share his values. And so it's very much the opposite of, if you actually look at the structure of the plot in the novel, it's very much the opposite of the caricature people have in their heads.
Yeah, and I thought that observation took on added poignancy when you think of perhaps Ayn Rand's own loneliness, you know, and her desire for a community, for other minds that she could connect with. Another counterintuitive take, you remarked on, quote, how much of Atlas Shrugged was a tribute to the American common man. Do you want to elaborate on that?
This is something that I find fascinating, actually, because, again, one of the caricatures here is Ayn Rand hated the average person, the common man. I think there's a fascinating evolution that happens as she comes from Russia to the United States, because her very earliest thing, she had a unpublished notes for a story called The Little Street. And it's very much sort of, it's sort of like there are themes that are in The Fountainhead later, but it's much more angry and bitter. And there's much more the sense of the common man being venal and corrupt and hating the extraordinary person. Whereas by the time you get to The Fountainhead, you know, you have characters thrown in, like there's Mike the welder, who are thrown in specifically to create a bond between the extraordinary man and the common man. And the idea of sort of this contempt for the common man as being corrupt and vicious, that's embodied in Hank Rearden, that's embodied in Gail Wydand, who is portrayed as being mistaken. And that's part of where he goes wrong. So there's this evolution in her view of the common man. And I think it comes partly from her being from a Russian context, because there's this whole Russian tradition coming up, in the decades before she was born and before she came to the US, of, the Russia had the intellectuals in Russia generally had the idea of wanting something better, a more liberal system, or some kind of reformed system, something other than the tyranny of the czars. But they oftentimes, when they would stick their necks out, they would find that there was no support coming to them from the common man on the Russian street, who seemed to like having a strong man. And, the more things change, the more things stay the same. And so there was a tremendous bitterness in the Russian intelligentsia towards the common man. But you also saw that one of the authors that she read is Ortega y Gasset, a Spanish writer who wrote about, I think it was called The Revolt of the Masses, and which the sub theme of part of it is partly that the masses are revolting, in the other sense of the word. So there was this sense of there's this very European sense of the intellectuals trying to strive for something better and the common man being indifferent, and this tremendous bitterness, which I think she absorbed from the Russian context and she got from some of the European intellectuals that she read. But then she comes to America, right? And she just counters the American common man. And you see this evolution where by the time you get to Atlas Shrugged, the one person that the one group of people that Dagny Taggart can count on getting along with, or that Hank Rearden can count on getting along with, other than other producers like herself, are the guys on, the track workers, the blue collar workers out there, the American common man. Or as I put out in my book, there's, one of the, I think people tend to underestimate the role of Eddie Willers, that how crucial he is to the plot and how much of the plot he's in. And I point out, if you think of this as a movie, if you could actually film all of Atlas Shrugged as a movie, Eddie Willers would have this enormous amount of screen time because he spends all this time talking to this mysterious worker. Now, spoiler alert, I like to not, for people who are new, but I think this audience is not going to be that new. The worker turns out to be John Galt. So the greatest hero and your sort of everyman character, Eddie Willers, are close friends who spend hours and hours talking with one another. And that's a central thread that goes through and serves all sorts of purposes in the plot of the novel. So it shows that she went through this evolution on her view of the common man. And I think it was her encounter with the American common man who sort of embodied these Enlightenment ideals and the Enlightenment individualism that I think changed her outlook on that.
Well, and speaking of a potential future adaptation of Atlas Shrugged into a film, you offered up what was a very intriguing idea, I thought, which was to cast actors who bore resemblance to current political figures, who matched the characters in some significant respect. So I think you had Paul Krugman for Wesley Mouch, Bernie Sanders for Eugene Lawson, and you had a special recommendation for the role of the president, the head of state, and that was—
He's not the president; he's the head of
the head of state. I know. You have that in here, which I thought was really interesting, and I will quote it. There's the relentless glad-handing. There's the lowbrow colloquialisms. There's the soul of the horse-trading machine politician. But above all else, there's one thing: his weakness for poorly thought through brainstorms that seem really shrewd but end in disaster. And you said that was the classic Joe Biden. So my question is, that seems particularly prescient, particularly given what's happened in the last few weeks, but has your experience actually watching Joe Biden in the role of head of state, has it changed or added to your casting recommendation?
Yeah, I'm going to have to start referring to him as the head of the state from now on. Because Ayn Rand does something interesting there, that when she has, it's the legislature and not Congress, it's the head of the state and not the president. So she wants to sort of subtly let us know, you're not in Kansas anymore, that this American system in the novel is not quite what it is in the one that we're familiar with. But I think Joe Biden has, yeah, he's lived down. Now, I won't call it prescient though, because I mean, this is a guy who's been in politics since, I don't know if it, since I was like 3 years old when he was first elected to office. So he's been in politics my entire life. And at the time I wrote that, I was observing him as, I think he was just finishing up 8 years as vice president. So this was retrospective, identifying all those qualities of his character. And boy, is that borne out by what he's doing now. I think it's a line that's written about Wesley Mouch, but it applies to Biden and to Mr. Thompson as well, which is something he's the 0 point at the meeting of opposing forces, and he aspired to be nothing else. And that's sort of, that's Joe Biden sort of sleepwalked into the presidency, and I think that's what he is. He's the meeting point he's the 0 at the meeting point of opposing forces. But that came out, that idea of casting the characters out of real life people came from the fact that covering politics is what I do as a, on a day-to-day basis, but also from, I think, the power of a movie, a short movie, of trying to sort of adapt it in that way, is that you can make it fully realistic for the reader. Because I find a lot of people go through, especially the character. So who is John Galt anyway, as the main title of the book, is one of the chapters is basically saying, addressing this fact that I think a lot of people, when they first encounter John Galt, they don't know what to make of him, because a book requires you're reading words on a page, and you have to take these characters and you have to translate them in your own mind into real, living, breathing people. And John Galt's so unusual, and he's unusual in a very specific way that I'd like to talk about later. That people have a hard time translating him. And so people will say, oh, he's an empty character. He's just a spokesman for this philosophy. There's no character there. There is. It's just that it's very hard for somebody on their own to translate. It's harder than I think for some of the other characters for somebody to translate that. And so that's why I think coming up with these real life examples of saying, like Eugene Lawson is the sort of humanity in Atlas Shrugged. He's the bloodthirsty humanitarian, right? He is the guy who is sort of this mushy guy who bleeds with sympathy for the common man, but is always in favor of the most drastic and draconian possible solution to any problem. He's the one who said that John Galt's piece is vicious because it'll make people want to be happy, right? So he's the bloodthirsty humanitarian, and I always think of Bernie Sanders as that he's a guy who talks about how compassionate he is. But the dominant character of all his speeches is this incredible contempt and anger that he has for the world. So he's your bloodthirsty humanitarian. And Joe Biden is now, this actually came out of, I did some work once on trying to do a screenplay for Atlas Shrugged. And when you do that and you go through all this dialogue, and Ayn Rand, it's part of the nature of the novel as a medium, that an author writes 10 times as many words as you could possibly use in a film on screen, because film is a visual medium. This is a medium of words. So you had to take the dialogue of every character and filter it down. And in doing that with Mr. Thompson, I was trying to visualize, how would he talk? How would he act? What are the parts that I really need to keep of his dialogue? And I found I could get him spot on if I just thought of Joe Biden in my mind, that he is the living characterization. And I think it's important for the novel to realize that, because Joe Biden is the guy who always has these brainstorms, these great ideas that seem convincing to him and turn into disaster in practice. And I think that sort of, if you get that, you sort of get how it is that Mr. Thompson lets himself get talked into doing this whole big event where he puts John Galt on live TV. And of course, it ends in disaster. But why he would do that, the impulsiveness of that, comes from this, the foolishness of the character, that it is helpful to grasp it helps using Joe Biden as a model to grasp that. And I think we've seen that with this withdrawal from Afghanistan, that he had this idea in his head as how it was going to work, and it was totally unrealistic and ended in disaster. But because he's the 0 at the meeting point of opposing forces, he is not able to project the consequences and think of things. I talked about how politicians, they don't think of things as being really real. They think of the opposing forces pushing in against them and how to appease these different forces. And I think because of that, because he's not able to see things as fully real, he's not able to do things in a rational way and project the actual consequences of his actions.
Well, you had another chapter in the book on management secrets of Atlas Shrugged, which was actually, you excerpted that as an article, which had caught my eye, and that was originally what was going to be the subject of our interview, but that was before I delved into the entire book. So I'm going to skip over those for now. We're going to put the link to that article in our comment section so people can go out and check it out. But as I said to you, I wanted to leave time to talk about objectivism and also to get to some of our audience questions, because I think we had one of the records in our registration for this, at least on Zoom. But I did want to get to one more chapter in your book, which was Did Dominique Franklin Win? Because it has, I would say, the best exposition that I've read juxtaposing the benevolent and malevolent universe premise. And it helped me a lot personally with what has always been my biggest sort of sore point, my biggest frustration in my job leading the Atlas Society. And that's when I confront the pessimism that so many objectivists who seem to believe that, the ideological battles are lost, that the victory of collectivism is now unavoidable. And so, therefore there's really no point in anything that I'm doing, and also no point in supporting such work. So it seems like you may have also encountered this attitude as well from those who you said glory a little too much in the end of days atmosphere in the later chapters of Atlas Shrugged, as if that were the goal. And in the real world, they sometimes advocate voting for the greater evil, as if the goal of politics were to hasten destruction. So what was helpful to me in providing me the moral fuel to keep fighting was how you reframed this phenomenon, not as a moral issue, and I think that's why I was getting frustrated, but as a metaphysical one. You can either muster that fuel or you can't. And so, not to kind of get angry with people who can't. It's not just like they're being perverse, but it's just they don't have it in them. So I'd love it if you'd unpack that a little bit.
I think anybody who's been in the objectivist movement for a while has sort of encountered that strain of pessimism, and sometimes you want to sort of shake people by the lapels and sort of rouse them out of it. So to explain a little bit about the title, Did Dominique Franklin Win? So I'm somebody who read the Fountainhead, the Atlas Shrugged first. But other people have read the Fountainhead first. And it was in thinking about how would you look at Atlas Shrugged if you had read the Fountainhead first, that one of the things that struck me is when you get to the early scenes where Francisco de Anconia is basically saying the world's corrupt and I'm deliberately going out and destroying things so it will crumble faster, you would immediately recognize that, oh, that's Dominique Franklin from the Fountainhead. And when Dagny is saying, no, I'm going to keep working and I'm going to, she wants to do her work her way, you'd recognize her as Howard Rourke. But then of course things get reversed, that she's the one who comes around to Francisco's viewpoint and not the other way around, which is what we'd expect if you were a reader of the Fountainhead. So I tried to sort of use that as a springboard to analyze this issue of optimism versus pessimism. And I think in objectivism, it comes from in objectivism specifically as a movement, it comes from this long history of, I used to say that the standard objectivist analysis of current events or the state of the world for most of the time that I've been in the movement has been something along the lines of, we're in decline. We once had good ideas and they've been abandoned. I just hope the final collapse doesn't come in my lifetime. Have a good evening. Thanks everybody for coming to my talk. And that was sort of this relentless pessimism. And it's not just objectivist though, because there's been a bit of a vogue recently, just starting now, a little movement more broadly in the culture to recognize the existence of progress. And, so like Steven Pinker has the book Enlightenment Now that he published recently.
Marion Tupy.
Yeah, and he spends like 200 pages at the beginning of the book going through over all these statistics to show comprehensively how life is so much better than it was, 20 years ago or 50 years ago or 100 years ago. Basically, the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution radically improved human life. Instead of shaking people out of their anti-progress attitudes. I've been an advocate of that for a long time. And I'm actually, for one of the other things I'm working on, Symposium, I'm actually going to start something on, what would our debate look like? What would the arguments we have look like? Political arguments and cultural arguments we have. What would they look like if we recognized that progress was real and it actually happened? And instead of what a lot of our discussion is now, and what a lot of objectivist discussion has been, which is how do we assign blame for the fact that the world is falling apart, right? So it's like, well, here's this bad thing that's happening, here's this bad thing happening here, and it's all happening because you haven't accepted my ideas. And that's sort of been the model for debating this among objectivists and in the culture in general. I think we should have, as there's more of a discussion of, given how much enormous progress has happened in the world in the last 200 years, who gets the credit for it? And we should be arguing for our share of the credit. Well, it was because of reason. It was because of the advances of science. It was because of individualism and greater degree of freedom. And that's what produced all these tremendous advances we've had. We should be all fighting over our share of the credit. And you can imagine what a different conversation that would be, right? So, I'm having these discussions right now of talking to welfare state people, advocates of the welfare state, and they're saying, oh, well, actually, it's the welfare state that helped improve. And then we have to have an argument about, well, no, the welfare state didn't do it. It was actually done by, free markets and greater production. And that's a much more interesting, and I think in some ways more enlightening debate to have, because it recenters things on, not on the imminent collapse, but on the ways in which the power of human beings to make progress and to create and to achieve, which is really the underlying message of Atlas Shrugged. So that's why I think the people who act as if Dominique Franklin won, right? The people who take the more pessimistic interpretation, even objectivists and fans of the novel who take the more pessimistic message from Atlas Shrugged, they need to look at it really as it's a message about the power of the human mind, the power of human creativity and perseverance to triumph over adversity and to improve things and make things better. And I think that's where we need to have the refocus onto and away from the pessimism.
And then, in your description, you'd also talked about different characters who maybe shared a lot of the values, like Cameron, for example, in The Fountainhead. And it wasn't necessarily a moral failing, but that he just couldn't find it within himself to share that optimism.
One of the powers of, the real power of Ayn Rand's writing and of her philosophy is, especially on morality, is that she realizes that morality is based on a metaphysical base. And it's a metaphysical base in the sense of your view of what the world is and what's possible to human beings in the world. And that has a profound effect in shaping your view of morality, basically saying what's possible to human beings. So fundamentally, the pessimistic outlook is not a moral outlook. It is a metaphysical outlook. It's that someone has let the bitterness or the frustration or the anger or the sense of the existence of obstacles overwhelm for them all the evidence of our ability to create and to achieve. And I find that kind of in a way, not is the shaking people by the lapels aspect of it. I find that a little inexcusable in today's context because we have it so good, because life today is so infinitely better than it was 200 years ago. There's so many, not just technological improvement, but so many more opportunities that people have in life. I mean, just the fact that I'm broadcasting, to you here. You're in you're in California, I think.
Malibu, yes.
I'm in the middle of nowhere in Central Virginia, and I'm able to do this. And I regularly have things. So I was reading some years ago. I was reading a book by William Shirer, famous reporter from the 1930s and 40s, and he talked about when CBS was this new startup radio show, a radio network, how he organized the first World News Roundup. So the idea is they got on the telephone, they got reporters from Rome and Berlin and Paris and London, and they were all broadcasting, all at the same time broadcasting to listeners back in America. And this had never been done before. It was a totally radical thing. Well, the other day I did a podcast where I had one person in Paris and one person in Mumbai, and we were having a discussion back and forth. And I could just do that, a regular guy, no major budget, no major technology, a regular guy out of a cellar in the middle of nowhere in Virginia. I can do that, so casually. The possibilities we have for us, available to us, are so vast that I think that there's a perversity in then saying we're doomed. I actually call it cultural Malthusianism. I've got something coming out on that in a bit. Where Thomas Malthus famously had the idea that population is going to expand and it's going to create more problems and more needs, and our production can't possibly expand to keep up with it. And he was wrong, because people come up with new ideas and new innovations. He was writing basically before the Industrial Revolution. He didn't realize that people would come up with new innovations at such an amazing pace that not only would we keep up with the growth of population, but our production would vastly outpace the growth of population, and people will become much wealthier. Well, I think there's a cultural or ideological Malthusianism behind this. The idea that our problems out in the world are multiplying at such a rate that it's overwhelming our intellectual ability to come up with new ideas and good ideas to counter those problems. And it implies that we humans are just going to sit back passively, that we're not capable of coming up with and accepting and listening to the ideas that we need in order to cope with the problems that we have. Whereas I think we will come up with and accept new ideas we're capable of doing that at a faster rate than we have new problems.
And I think that is more consonant with the kinds of things that you hear the characters, the heroes in Atlas Shrugged. They say, I'll figure it out. I don't know now, but I'm confident that I will figure it out. And I can't emphasize how important I thought that chapter is. And it's important as well, for people who are in the business of promoting ideas and running think tanks, because I've noticed in my 5 or so years, at least in this think tank position, I was previously at the Cato Institute, that there's almost two different kinds of models. And one is sort of, I call it the opera model, where you have products and services for your donors. You have summer conferences, or you have fancy retreats, or what have you. And then there is the other kind of model, which is you may never get to go to a fancy, hobnob with other donors, but you're paying for actual products and services which are about advancing a mission. And that's what I'm trying to do at the Atlas Society, although while also preserving an opportunity for people to get together. And given that this has absolutely flown. I want to get to talking about objectivism, but maybe a couple of quick hits here from some of our folks that have questions. George Barker wants to know whether an atheist reads the Bible. Might that also be coming out as a book at some point?
I have to at least do the whole Old Testament before I can publish that. Like I said, it's in the back burner because, it's not, my main focus is not religious studies at this point in my life. So it will, for now, subscribers are going to have to, you can find it on the website. And I think it's, for subscribers don't have to worry about the paywall. But eventually that will be a book, but I'm not promising any kind of timeline on that because I've got too many other things that are more sort of central to my work that I'm working on.
Yes, and I've already put in a vote for getting this onto Audible, which maybe we might be able to help with. David Horowitz, David, you didn't respond to my emails when I was in San Francisco. I'd still love to see you and Donna, but here's a quick question, and one I know that you address in your book, is if Ayn Rand had a love for the common man, why was there no room for Eddie Willers at Galt's Gulch?
I do address that because I have a whole thing on the Galt and Eddie relationship. Well, Galt doesn't ask him, but then you have to remember that Galt knows Eddie better than anybody else in the book, right? He spends hours and hours and hours talking with him in the cafeteria. He does get an offer. He gets the offer from Dagny. So Ayn Rand dealt with that. Like, well, why doesn't Eddie go? Because, it's not that she had a ban on assistants going with people, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the things I like to point out to tweak the conservatives is that when Danconia Copper collapses, Francisco comes to the Galt's Gulch, and he comes with a bunch of his top workers. So I said that Galt's Gulch's population is expanded by an influx of undocumented Latin American workers. But so it's clear that other people are bringing their assistance. I don't know if Gwen Ives ever makes it to that Reardon's secretary ever makes it to Galt's Gulch. I suspect she would be welcome. So she puts in there a line where Dagny says to Eddie, don't you want to come too? I don't remember the exact words, but aren't you going to come also? And he says, no, I can't. So she puts that in there. So we never get that Galt makes an offer to him, but we, like I said, Galt knows him better than anybody else. And I think she wanted to keep him out there because she wanted to, remember, she's dramatizing the role of the great producers and creators and thinkers in the world. So she has to have a character who represents the common man and all the virtues of the common man. But she also has to then show what happens to him when all of the great producers, the people who are above, who are operating at a higher level, when all of them disappear. So that's why Eddie has to stay. Literally, it's required that he has to stay in the world. And that's something people say. People treat Atlas Shrugged sometimes like it's a documentary, and what happens to the characters, it has to be what you would want to actually happen in the real world. And remember, this is an author, this is a writer who's got a theme that she's trying to get across, and all the characters exist to serve that theme. I say the author is the god of her little world, and the people are there to be used for her inscrutable purposes. So she has her purposes, and the purpose of Eddie staying in the world and not going with Dagny is that so he can be there at that last scene that he has with his uncertain fate of showing what happens to the honest common man when the great producers and creators and achievers have exited from the world. So he needs to be there to show that, and that's why she keeps him.
All right. Well, in the last 8 or 9 minutes that we have, and we're not on any strict timetable, so we can go over if your schedule allows. I wanted to ask, why do you think it is that objectivism hasn't gained a greater influence over culture and political discourse? You were talking about we should be fighting for the credit, of all of the progress that's happened. And I think there is a argument to be made that Ayn Rand can lay claim to a good portion of that credit in the secondary influences that she's had. But is it that sort of pessimism, optimism? Is it, politics? What's your
there's a number of things. I think I keep small things and I have a big thing. One of the small things is that Ayn Rand is somewhat unusual as a writer in that a lot of what she wrote was tied into commentary of the events of her time. So, for example, there's an article she did, Extremism or the Art of Smearing. And the actual content of the article is basically about epistemology and how concepts are formed. And she introduces the idea of an anti-concept. But the actual article is commenting on the Republican National Convention of 1964. So part of the problem I think we have right now, because I think Ayn Rand did have a huge influence on an older generation of conservatives, because during the Cold War, she was vitally necessary to them. She was the person when the conflict was individualism versus collectivism, the US versus the Soviet Union, she was vitally necessary and important to help explain that. But I think what's happened is after the Cold War, I've been noticing a younger generation of conservatives who have different concerns and different aspects that they want to address. And I think she loses a certain amount of relevance because she's writing in that context of the big political and the culture wars, if you will, of the 20th century, which is not the same thing as the culture war of the 21st century. So that's part of it. And I think one of the things I've been wanting to do is sort of do an updated series of saying, okay, let's take some of Ayn Rand's articles where she introduces some of these big ideas, and I've got a sort of series in the works of taking them and saying, oh, how do these apply to the current controversies, and take her ideas out of that context of the 20th century, in which she wrote a lot of those things. She wasn't just an abstract philosopher who wrote treatises. She wrote articles on current political events, and then inserted these philosophical ideas into those. So can we update some of that? I think that would help. But the big one is that I think there's been too much emphasis, and it's almost like the problem with the objectivist movement is there's been too much emphasis on Ayn Rand. Now I want to explain that, which is that there's been a lot of emphasis to say, how can we take Ayn Rand to promote her ideas? And I think we also have to have just as much emphasis on how can we go out and create new things of our own. She wrote a great line in Atlas Shrugged, a great line of dialogue into the mouth of Robert Sadler, who's like one moment of dignity, is he says, at last, a crucial new achievement that's not mine. And what we need is more emphasis on how can people who are objectivists, who are influenced by Ayn Rand's ideas, how can they create their own achievements, taking her ideas and using them and applying them to create their own achievements that will have an impact on the culture. Because I think that it's a mistake about the way ideas spread. And it's one thing I noticed persistently, along with the pessimism and objectivism, there's been a persistent idea that everything goes from the top down. So the idea that, we get objectivists teaching philosophy at Harvard, and then everything will flow just from that. And that we will have won the battle and everything will flow from that. Whereas I look at how a culture changes, and a lot of times it changes from the bottom up, from people creating art, from people creating history, from people working in journalism, from people who are inventors and scientists, that all of this stuff comes up from all the different achievements. And my sort of view of how the culture would change is that you would have rational ideas in psychology, and rational ideas in science, and rational ideas in history, et cetera. So that by the time a person reads Atlas Shrugged or reads one of Ayn Rand's works of philosophy, they'd say, well, duh, everybody knows this. Of course, the mind is the source of all wealth. Everybody knows that. That's basic economics 101. That if you had these ideas, rational ideas percolating through all these different fields all at once, rather than just all coming down from the Harvard philosophy department faculty lounge, that you would have, that's how you have a profound effect on the culture. So I think it's more of the idea of objectivists going out, and objectivist intellectuals and individual objectivists going out and accomplishing new things that will draw attention to the content of their ideas. That would prepare the ground for that much more effectively. So I think it's crucial new ideas that are not hers. That's what we need in that sense of people taking her ideas and using them to create important new things.
That's interesting. I hadn't quite thought of it that way. I would add to that my take, which is, people need to be aware. They need to have some consciousness of the author of her works. And I've noticed in my 30 years or so of being interested in her work, going from any time Ayn Rand's name was brought up to becoming something very controversial and very negative and very adversarial, to about 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, at least in California, when I moved out here, that I was getting a blank stare. And I actually found that to be encouraging in one respect, that, okay, yes, maybe there's no awareness, but at least we could start reintroducing the author and the ideas from our own perspective. And in guiding my work, what I take is the metaphor that Ayn Rand uses in her address to the graduating class of West Point, of an astronaut crash landing on a foreign planet and having the choice to look around and examine, what is the new terrain or not. And to me, examining the new terrain means, okay, if this is our objective, we want to talk to young people where are they? Oh, they're on TikTok. Okay, well, how do we get, our message on TikTok? Oh, they're on Instagram. They're, watching this kind of animated video. There's this huge explosion of graphic novels. So that's kind of my my take on that. But I also think we need a explosion of a lot of different ideas of competition, of experimentation, and that I think would just kind of help to cross-pollinate and see what works and learn from the rest.
Well, talking about optimism and pessimism is a great story I like to tell on this. Picked it up from a guy named Benjamin Zander. And he tells the story. The story is about two shoe salesmen sent down from London to sub-Saharan Africa in the 19th century. And they're sent to assess the market for shoes. And they send back two different telegrams. And one says, situation hopeless, they don't wear shoes. And the other one sends a telegram that says, unlimited opportunity, they don't have shoes yet. And that's sort of, I think, where objectivism is, that, it's an unlimited opportunity because people don't have these ideas yet. I think we have to have the confidence that these ideas have value, that people need them, that people will seek them out even as an answer to the problems that they're going to be facing. So these ideas have tremendous value. It's a matter of basically letting people know that this is actually possible. That this is available, that making them aware of it. And I think, unlimited opportunity, because they don't have Atlas Shrugged yet.
I agree. And that's what I always say when I am at these student conferences where we exhibit at, at least a dozen student conferences a year. And the kids come up and I ask, have you ever heard of Ayn Rand? Have you ever read? And they're like, the little shame face, no, I haven't. And I said, well, I wish I was in your shoes because you have your adventure ahead of you. I can't go on that adventure again for the first time. So, well, listen, we are past time. This has been spectacular. Robert, thank you very much. I want to encourage all of you to go out there, you won't regret it, and get a copy of his book. Robert, you're on Twitter, any other places where people should go up and sign up for your letter?
They should go to Tracinski letter, tracinskiletter.com, TRACINSKI letter.com. That's sort of the main omnibus. I publish a bunch of different places, but everything will be announced or linked to there. It's sort of the main, it's my personal newsletter. It's the main hub for my work. You'll get everything from, the Bible to current politics there. And
also I'll recommend a few of the interviews that he has on Symposium. They're ranging from music to foreign policy, to philosophy, all over the place, but I would highly recommend those. And I want to thank all of you who have joined us. If you enjoy this kind of interview and also the work that we're doing to introduce young people to the ideas of Ayn Rand, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to the Atlas Society, and perhaps even come to our gala on November 4th in Malibu. And would love to continue this conversation. Perhaps I'm going to send Robert an invite to Clubhouse and see if I can lure him to spend a little bit of time with us there. Scott, I know you had a question that I couldn't get to. Perhaps we'll get to them in a conversation on Clubhouse. So thank you, Robert. And thank you all. We'll see you next week. Take care.